Hi there, my name is Justin Ridgewell. I'm the Environment Agency's Coastal Advisor for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. My main area of responsibility is delivering on the EA's Strategic Coastal Overview role, and I'm leading the EA's project team participating in the SARC project and delivering the pilot nature-based solution investment at Newlyn. For this presentation, under the theme of capacity building, I'm speaking about facilitation of long-term thinking for decision makers and local politicians within the context of coastal change, sustainable coastal management and adaptation. So within the realm of coastal management, if we want to create a step change in the thinking of local decision makers and politicians and move away from the more typical short-term reactive stance we see based around fail and fix of defences, with short-term investments that are often more aligned to political time cycles than to long-term climate change impacts and coastal change, we need to develop ways of engaging that allow us to evolve in a collaborative spirit towards long-term thinking as the norm rather than the exception. Therefore, what I'm looking at in this presentation is how a sequence of planned steps can help us do this, starting out with the notion of place-based working through to the delivery of adaptation with a series of steps in between. So this facilitation of more effective long-term thinking really starts with the place-based approach and an understanding of local issues and risks which underpin the decision to invest time and resources into making a place more sustainable, which then in turn allows us to build consensus and strengthen the sense of place that people feel. Building capacity into local place-based planning through neighbourhood plans, town plans, public realm improvements, regeneration and place-shaping projects, which are, by necessity, forward-looking, can build capacity through local decision-makers and politicians to potentially deliver the community consensus and investments that allow a sustainable long-term response to coastal change to be delivered. An essential early step in this process is developing and sharing a strategic narrative. The EA's recently adopted National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy really represents a step change in the mandate provided for us to do things differently and break away from the old ways of thinking. No longer is the focus on protection and defence, but instead on adaptation and resilience. It encourages us to ensure that all growth and infrastructure is sustainable and resilient to future climate change impacts, and advocates for educating and encouraging a much broader community-based understanding of risk and an ownership of that risk. So in that way, it very much supports that decentralised, place-based way of working. These core ambitions embedded within the strategy deliver a very convincing strategic message, and they inherently require longer-term thinking to be adopted by local decision makers. But it's perhaps the more regional initiatives which help to deliver a more local flavour when we're delivering the strategic narrative as the backdrop to long-term thinking for those local decision makers. For example, Cornwall's environmental growth strategy is a key piece of thinking, based upon the concept that Cornwall Council recognises it is no longer sufficient to be simply trying to protect and conserve the environment. Rather, it needs to be actively invested in. And it's based around some key principles, including that in Cornwall, at least, the environment forms the basis of the economy. So a healthy environment equals a healthy economy. And it recognises that both the blue economy and green economy are equally important. Ultimately, having this strategic vision for the environment helps build consensus in the community and builds an acceptance of change. This in turn supports and encourages that longer-term thinking at a local level, building a narrative around delivering improvements for both present and future generations, whilst also supporting new imperatives on carbon reduction and reversing ecological decline. Of course, of particular relevance to the SARC project and our nature-based solution work at Newlyn is that we are operating in that zone where the green economy and the blue economy meet. So the economy becomes as dynamic as the shoreline itself, and the NBS element of the work helps with those ambitions to not just protect, but to reverse ecological decline by creating habitat and aiming to deliver biodiversity net gain. Of course, for our place-based delivery to be effective, this strategic narrative needs to be distilled down into local plans. This is where the Shoreline Management Plan and its local policy comes in. The SMP provides local interpretation of the strategic narrative, with local policy units established along the coastal frontage and associated policy statements which describe the general management intent. Now, the SMP is very evidence-based, but also widely consulted upon during development, and it's overseen by an elected members' forum. The local decision makers and politicians can have confidence in the democratic way in which the policies have been proposed and adopted. And the application of policies which change through time across the broad time horizons, or epochs, which are utilised by the SMP, out to 100 years in the future, helps to establish an overall direction of travel for the coastal management. Really, with the ultimate goal of ensuring that the shoreline position in 100 years' time is more sustainable than it is now. And this should further nurture and encourage that long-term thinking. At this point in the process, actually visualising the coastal change and understanding what the future looks like becomes really important. For local decision makers and politicians, it's important to understand the scale, nature and rate of change in 3 dimensions, particularly in relation to the spatial scale of change. How widely is an area being affected? From the temporal scale, how quickly is change happening? The mechanism of change. Is the change event-driven and unpredictable, or a more constant and steady process? The context. What are the main characteristics of the area experiencing change? And finally, the consequence. What impact does the change actually have on people, wildlife, and landscape? In Bude, on the north coast of Cornwall, as part of an Adaptive Approaches pilot project, we've been using photorealistic 3D terrain models and expert geomorphological analysis to help do this. This has allowed us to build a set of composite visualizations depicting coastal change at various time steps into the future. Using approaches like this to build consensus with local decision makers and politicians around a set of credible future coastal change scenarios will, I believe, be instrumental in determining a community's ability to respond to change in an adaptable and inclusive way. So by visualising and understanding what the future looks like under an unconstrained coastal change scenario, we can start to plan and design an adaptive approach framed by that long-term goal of improving sustainability over time, but with the adaptive pathways thinking, which applies iteration and decision points to allow updated data and the latest climate science to be utilised, future uncertainty to be accounted for. This allows a review and a refocusing of priorities as and when required, and it avoids locking in approaches which then compromise the ability of a community or place to adapt more rapidly or more slowly or in a different direction than originally envisaged. Adaptive approaches is all about keeping future doors open rather than closing them down. We want to be able to, at intervals, stop and consult the map and decide which route we now want to take, rather than be forced down a single narrow corridor of management. This all further requires local decision makers, politicians and officers to adopt a long-term approach, because whilst actions and interventions may sometimes be short-term, the requirement to keep all of those future doors open requires long-term and expansive thinking, and may also rely on effective implementation of planning tools, such as coastal change management areas. And it's then in this space that nature-based solutions, both in the form of pilots and larger scale investments, can become central to delivering outcomes in line with longer term and more expansive thinking. Delivering adaptation in a dynamic, flexible way and multiple benefits relating to environmental growth that include habitat creation, carbon minimisation, mitigation, ecotourism. These are all potentially benefits which can galvanise local decision makers into advocating for longer term thinking. And then, as a final step, we come to monitoring, data collection, and the production of new evidence which can shape and hone the delivery of that iterative, adaptive process. In some ways, of course, this could be the starting point because data and evidence will, along with other socio-economic drivers, dictate those places and communities where we invest time and resources into a more sustainable future. But it also represents a review and decision point within the adaptation pathway journey. The monitoring of our coasts and the physical data, which allows us to capture the real change occurring, together with updated climate science and projections for future sea level rise, then drive the iterative element of long-term thinking and capacity building. Whilst in reality, these stages of engagement, planning and review will overlap and sometimes merge, hopefully this process does at least start to facilitate change. And if as coastal management practitioners and scientists we can bring the local decision makers and politicians along with us on this journey, we will have a much greater chance of embedding that all-important long-term thinking that will pave the way for responding to coastal change in a collaborative, effective and sustainable way. Okay, that's about it. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting or useful. And please do get in contact if you'd like more information on our Newlyn pilot work, which is being delivered as part of the SARC project. Thank you.